At the Portsmouth Naval Base, Britain prepares for the worst in the Suez crisis. President Nasser continues to defy the Western powers on his seizure of the canal and seeks the support of Russia and the Arab League countries. Meanwhile, a French fleet sails from Toulon as diplomats desperately seek a conference that will head off war.
The Suez Canal crisis of 1956 highlighted the important economic and strategic role played by the canal in international diplomacy. Since its completion in 1869, the Suez Canal has been a vital artery for global trade and transportation between East and West, especially in regard to petroleum shipping. Its central status as a world crossroads has made control of the canal a vital priority for global politics and a flashpoint for regional tensions across the Middle East. The consequences of 50 years of diplomatic successes and failures at Suez continue to shape the balance of power in the modern world.
A waterway connecting the Mediterranean and Red Seas shortens the sea voyage between Europe and Asia by nearly 6,000 miles. The rich potential for linking east-west trade has been recognized since ancient times. After many failed attempts throughout history, engineering breakthroughs in the 1850s finally made construction of the canal feasible.
Engineering difficulties were not the only thing holding back construction, however. The European powers debated the potential consequences of building the canal, especially with regard to Britain's monopoly on eastern trade. The French were eager to proceed, while British diplomat George Baldwin warned that France in possession of Egypt would hold the master key to all the trading stations of the earth, and England would hold her possessions in India at the mercy of France. Britain's support was finally won in 1857 after it took 4 months to deliver military reinforcements and supplies during a rebellion in India.
After 10 years of construction, the canal opened for trade in November 1869. However, within a decade, domestic, economic, and military troubles in Egypt led to Britain's gaining control of the canal.
By the mid-20th century, however, England's status as a world power was declining rapidly. Numerous colonies achieved independence, including India in 1947 and Egypt in 1952. At the same time, demand for petroleum products increased exponentially, especially in Europe and the United States, making these world powers increasingly dependent on the vast oil reserves being discovered throughout the Red Sea and Persian Gulf area. In the mid-1950s, almost 2/3 of Europe's petroleum passed through the canal, and at its height, 2/3 of all ships traveling through were transporting oil. Meanwhile, the communist bloc was growing in influence not only in Europe but in the Middle East. The strategic central location of the Suez Canal played a major role throughout the end of colonialism and the height of the Cold War.
A new Middle East crisis arises as President Nasser of Egypt tells a wildly cheering crowd in Alexandria that Egypt has seized the internationally owned Suez Canal.
World War II partners Britain, France, and the US feared that Egypt seizing control of the canal would result in a dramatic increase in usage fees or even losing access to the canal entirely, crippling trade and making petroleum prices skyrocket. At an emergency conference, Britain and France argued in favor of forcefully removing Nasser from power and retaking the canal. The United States, however, worried about Egypt's growing alliance with the Soviet Union, advocated a more diplomatic approach.
Britain and France disregarded the American concerns and invited Israel's Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, to a secret meeting outside Paris. Playing on Israel's contentious political and military border with Egypt, the three nations devised a ruse to retake the Suez Canal from Egypt by force. Israel surged into Egyptian territory near Suez, and using this as an excuse, Britain and France sent troops to intervene. Within days, the entire region was occupied. President Dwight D. Eisenhower was furious that the other allies had defied the U.S. position.
The United States was not consulted in any way about any phase of these actions. We believe these actions to have been taken in error, for we do not accept the use of force as a wise or proper instrument for the settlement of international disputes.
Eisenhower's fears about the Soviet influence were well-founded. Egypt had recently received a huge shipment of arms from Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet Union threatened nuclear attacks against Paris and London over their involvement at Suez. The U.S. pressured their allies economically, and Eisenhower encouraged a United Nations conference that created the first ever international peacekeeping force, which was deployed to Suez.
The strain of this crisis marked a major turning point in the world balance of power. Britain was forced to finally accept the end of their former imperial glory, marked by the embarrassed resignation of Prime Minister Anthony Eden, later eulogized as the last Prime Minister to believe Britain was a great power and the first to confront a crisis which proved she was not.
Meanwhile, the emboldened Soviets pushed forward their invasion of Hungary, correctly believing that the Allied powers were too divided to mount an effective response. The Hungarian invasion represented a dramatic expansion of Soviet control in Europe, but preoccupation at Suez left the Western nations helpless to do anything about it. As Eisenhower's Vice President Richard Nixon noted afterward, we couldn't, on one hand, complain about the Soviets intervening in Hungary, and on the other hand, approve of the British and the French picking that particular time to intervene against Nasser.
The failed diplomacy of 1956 destabilized the region for 2 decades. The 1967 Six Days War between Egypt and Israel ended with Egypt's loss of both the Sinai Peninsula and the Suez Canal, as well as the forced resignation of President Nasser. The canal was badly damaged and closed for 8 years. Egypt instigated a new conflict in 1973 during a surprise army crossing of the Suez Canal on the Jewish holy day of Yom Kippur. The U.S. immediately sided with Israel while the Soviet Union gave military aid to Egypt, again threatening a major global confrontation. The United Nations stepped in to negotiate, brokering a ceasefire to end the war after a very tense 3 weeks. Although Israel retained control of most territory taken in 1967, Egypt was again granted authority over the canal.
The 1973 war marked another shift in the balance of power in the region, and eventually the creation of a more secure diplomatic solution. Soviet influence in the Middle East declined rapidly, while the U.S. renewed efforts to mediate and negotiate in the Middle East, giving substantial financial and humanitarian aid.
Egypt's president, Anwar Sadat, in turn, stunned the international community with his historic 1977 visit to Jerusalem to meet with Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin. In 1978, U.S. President Jimmy Carter brought Sadat and Begin together at the presidential retreat in Camp David, Maryland, where they reached an agreement on a framework for peace. The Camp David Accords gave the right of free passage by ships of Israel through the Suez Canal, among other things, and Israel agreed to withdraw its armed forces from the Sinai.
As Jimmy Carter reported to Congress in 1978, the strategic location of these countries and the resources that they possess can have a direct and immediate bearing on our own well-being as a nation and our hope for a peaceful world. In 2010, ships from 105 countries traveled through the canal, which remains a vital artery for the transport of oil. The Arab Spring revolutions of 2011 renewed the fears of 1956 about the canal closing, causing petroleum prices to rise preemptively. The U.S. uses this shortcut to send warships to Iraq and Afghanistan, and more than half of Europe's natural gas also transits the canal.
The significance of the Suez Canal has now grown beyond the superpowers of the past century. Last February, Iran sent 2 warships through the canal, angering Israel, who called it a provocation. Syria also agreed to let Iran dock her ships at the northern port of Latakia after sailing past the Israeli coast, giving Iran a presence in the Mediterranean for the first time. Israel recently sent submarines, allegedly equipped with nuclear weapons, through the Suez Canal as a show of force.
U.S. President Barack Obama's speech on the Middle East in May 2011 virtually echoes what Jimmy Carter said 3 decades ago.
And though these countries may be a great distance from our shores, we know that our own future is bound to this region by the forces of economics and security, by history, and by faith.
The history of the Suez Canal has seen diplomatic failures, as in the 1956 crisis and ensuing wars, and grand successes, as in the 1978 Camp David Accords. The consequences of both reverberate today in the Middle East and around the world. Though just over 100 miles long and not even 200 feet wide, the Suez Canal has well fulfilled its prophecy as the master key to all the trading stations of the earth.